Yes, Ms. Graham.
Thank you. Would you look please at paragraph 14 of your inquiry statement? There's a lot of different roles and people mentioned in this paragraph, and I'd like to just clarify who's who, if you don't mind. So we'll see this on the screen in a moment. Working arrangements in the overview, and you talk about a communications officer, a raid or intelligence officer, you talk about different people. Can I'd like to get a clearer picture from you about the delegation from you. I think you said at your previous evidence that you were you're the duty inspector and you were an ITFC, you're a firearms commander.
Yes.
You'd had special training for that. And you were the only person, as I understand it, who had the authority to deploy an armed response vehicle and firearms officers.
Yes.
Is that correct? But there was other support available for you within the ACR, but ultimately no system of delegation for firearms incidents or firearms events.
Yes.
And so can I ask you, the communications officer, I think you said at your previous evidence, was Michelle Hutchison.
That's correct.
We've seen her on the transcript as being referred to as Con 2. So did she have different titles?
That would have just been what she's probably logged in as. So, no, she's the communications officer. That would have been her, when she logged in on the system, that would have been what came up, what she was referred to as a system,
Right.
but shouldn't be called that. She was...
And she wasn't a police officer, she was a civilian member of staff,
Yes.
is that right?
Yes.
Can you explain to us what a communications officer does?
Yeah, I mean, the assist in the overview, part of the team monitor sort of radio channels, shout up specialist resources, take phone calls, liaise with like Transport Scotland, take general calls from inside the organisation, people phoning in asking for information, and also out with as well. So she had that sort of communications role effectively, but she was a good support just in general.
From what you're describing, would it be fair to say that she was providing you with administrative support?
Not just administrative support, but yeah, information. If there was an incident, she would provide information. She would be able to check systems as well as anybody else.
But she wasn't a deputy?
No.
And then you mentioned a raid or intelligence officer. Who
Yeah.
was that?
So that was a PC. I think it was Jeff Whelan on that day, but that was normally a police constable who were trained up. Normally they were a controller, they had these skills, but they specifically looked at sort of developing any intelligence, researching, so in a fast time incident they would be looking to identify who an individual was, check force systems to see if the person was known to the police, or do address checks, do vehicle checks. So they did that role, but they could also use the radio and shout up on the radio and do various things as well.
You've said they may have been a controller. Were they based in one of the pods?
No, we were all upstairs together in one room, with a overview sergeant to my left, the raid officer opposite me, and to my right was the communications officer. So we all sat at a table, a close table.
Right. And you were all in the overview? And the intelligence officer, or RAID, what does RAID stand for?
I think it's Research and Intelligence Desk, I think it was.
Right. And so we've heard from Mr. Masterton this morning that when things are on the storm log or calls are made over the airwaves transmission, there are things going on behind the scenes as well.
Yeah.
One of those things could be contact with the ambulance service, or contacting the dogs unit, that type of thing. So is that the sort of work that the intelligence officer would also get involved in?
Yeah, he would, but he would be doing more specific work, try to research systems, try to find out any information that was relevant to the incident as it was, because you're looking to build your information and intelligence all the time to assist the officers on the ground, and also myself and the control room with as much information as we possibly can.
But the most senior officer in the room, if you were out of the room, was Sergeant Dalglish.
Yes, that's correct.
As the overview sergeant, I think in paragraph 15 of your statement, you say, in my absence, the team under the direction of the sergeant would be looking at the information on all the calls that were coming into the control room to assess the information and pull out key and significant information. So he's deputising, if you like, for you.
Yeah, he can do everything that I can other than authorise the deployment of armed officers.
So subject to that, or the ARV, he can be involved with other things. So in terms of grade 1 calls, he can deal with everything up to the firearms element. Right. Can I ask you to look at paragraph 17, please? And again, you talk about different people who were involved in the incident. This goes over the page as well, but let me just summarise what I'm interested in. We've heard evidence from a number of different sources that there was a divisional inspector, divisional sergeant, ACR sergeant, East Overview sergeant, and the East Overview inspector. And I just want to put names to all of those job titles, if I may. We've heard that the divisional inspector on the 3rd of May in relation to this incident was Inspector K. Were you aware of that?
I wasn't aware of his name at the time, but there would have been a divisional inspector on.
And you'll remember from going through the spreadsheet that we've seen Stephen K.
Yes.
His name on it.
I spoke to him as well later on that morning.
You did, but you remember I put that audio call to you at your first evidence. Divisional sergeant on the ground was Acting Police Sergeant Maxwell. So where it's a divisional person, that's the people on the ground in the local area.
Yes.
Well, you said before you were in Bilston Glen, but in relation to this incident, they were in Kirkcaldy.
Yes.
ACR sergeant, that was Bissett in relation to this particular matter.
Yep, he would be on the floor supervising his group of controllers who were covering the Fife geographical area. So he would have oversight from a command and control perspective and be supporting them as well. We've
heard from Mr Masterton, there was a Fife pod and each individual controller within the pod would have a different town or area.
Yeah.
Right. The East Overview sergeant is Dalglish.
Scott Dalglish, yep.
Who's in the room with you, in the overview room.
Yep.
The East Overview inspector is another name for yourself.
Yes.
Duty inspector, ITFC.
Yeah.
So at any given time, can I ask you who was in charge? So when the calls came in, when officers have been deployed by Mr Masterton as the controller, before they arrive at the scene, who's in charge of things at that time?
In terms of
on the ground, what's happening? And
so that would be your divisional inspector and your divisional sergeant who were responsible for the incident that was happening in their geographical area, unless it became a firearms incident, in which case I would assess it, declare it, and I would take command of the firearms incident.
I think you said in your earlier evidence previously that if you had declared a firearms incident, you would effectively take charge of matters. But on this occasion, a firearms incident was never declared.
It wasn't within a period of time, no.
Yeah. So insofar as who's in charge before the officers arrive, that's Inspector K.
As the police incident officer.
As the police incident officer, and the sergeant on the ground, who was Maxwell.
Yes.
Once the police arrive,
Mm-hmm.
so the officers arrive initially, but Maxwell and Kay are not present at the scene at that time. Who's in charge of the incident at that time?
It doesn't change. It should still be the police inspector for the area and the sergeant who is attending along with these officers, albeit slightly behind.
So they don't need to be at the scene at the incident themselves, but they're still technically in charge or in command.
Yes, I mean, for an incident like this, you're looking for a supervisor, a sergeant, to go there as quickly as possible to supervise officers, provide that overview, provide that support and that initial sort of decision making on the ground with what he or she wants to do.
Thank you. Once the sergeant has arrived, so in this case Maxwell,
Yeah,
he's still in charge.
yes,
And he's actually in charge and on the scene.
yes,
And once Kay arrives, he's still in charge. He's PIO, but he's actually in charge and at the scene.
yes.
When they're both at the scene, does Kay have more authority than Maxwell?
Yeah, I mean, he's a divisional inspector, so ultimately he has that responsibility, but they'll work closely together, but it'll be the divisional inspector that should come up with any course of action.
If you have CID officers at the scene, does that alter that who's in charge?
It will still be the divisional inspector for that area, but if CID officers were taking, if they were going to look at the incident from a serious incident, serious crime perspective, if the circumstances in this incident as they changed became more serious, then the CID officers would take sort of charge of that investigative side of things. They would maybe have locus protection, create a log, put scene preservation in place, and that would probably be your detective constable initially, then detective sergeant, and then a detective inspector who would normally have SIO qualifications, a senior investigating officer. So they would be ultimately the ones who maybe would look at any investigative side of things, or if an incident was more serious.
At what point of what you know of this incident, at what point would things become or reach that level of seriousness that the CID would take over responsibility?
I would imagine when the circumstances in relation to the male changed and it became obvious that the situation had changed.
Would that be when he was noticed to be unconscious, or when he noticed to be not breathing?
I'm not sure which one, but both probably, unconscious and not maybe not breathing.
Would that be a situation where the level of seriousness became such that it would become something that the CID would maybe be more involved with and take control of?
Yes.
Thank you. Can we look at the circumstances? We've heard evidence that the first call from Harry Kohlberg came in at 7:10 in the morning.
Yes.
We saw earlier the storm cards. The first storm card, which was 231, you've got a copy of that. That incident was created at 7:14 and 17 seconds. And we know that the second one was created at 7:15. While I'm on this, can I ask why, if a call came in at 7:10, there was not a storm log until 7:14 and 7:15? Now, we heard this morning from Mr. Masterton that there was maybe another system being used at the time, and he referred to entries on the storm card that say incident created from CRM. And he wondered if there might be a time lag between a call taker actually being on the call with a member of the public and then putting something onto Storm. And he wondered if there was maybe a system called CRM where it would go on to first and then it would become the Storm. Do you know anything about that?
I've heard of CRM before. I don't. There's a possibility that was in existence. You were always. Yeah, CRM is something that they did actually add details to first, possibly, and then it was transferred to a Storm log. But I couldn't be 100% sure it wasn't mine.
We can maybe check up on that.
I do know that there's delays. There are delays all the time built in with that. So if a call comes in at 7:10 or whatever like that, when you actually factor in the as soon as it's answered, then you've got interaction with the call taker and the member of the public. They try to get information. They create an incident. They type the information on. So there's always a delay with Storm in terms of the timings. You're always kind of working with a time lag, effectively.
So there will be a time lag between the call coming in at 7:10 and the first incident being created at 4 minutes later.
Yeah. Yes.
And then we saw on the transcript, and we've referred to it a number of times, that you gave the stay safe message at 7:20.
Yes.
And we maybe don't need to look at that. So I'm interested in this period between 7:14, 7:15, when the first call comes in on Storm, and you giving the stay safe message. Now, I think if we look at paragraph 18 of your statement, you touched on this in your evidence earlier this year. I'm asked about the initial minutes following the first 999 call in relation to this incident prior to me transmitting on the radio at 7:20:13. I believe that I entered the East overview at around 7:18 and that I had been in there assessing the incident for just over 2 minutes prior to making that transmission. So in the period from 7:14, when the first call goes on to the Storm log, or 7:15, when the main log is created, you're not in the East overview room at that time.
Yes.
You're out of that room. And you returned to that room, you've said here, around 7:18. So that's a couple of minutes before the stay safe message, is it?
I think so.
And were you aware at the time that you entered the overview, if it was 7:18, that there had been 6 calls to Police Scotland by members of the public at that time?
No.
You weren't. What
No.
were you aware of at the time you entered the room?
I was shouted back up. I'm sure I was tannoyed back up by the overview, just to ask to return to the overview urgently. So I ran up the stairs, and that was when I entered the overview.
And was that the first point that you actually became aware that there'd been a grade 1 call and that matters had been progressed by the controller?
Yes.
Right. Looking at paragraph 18 again, you say, when I got into the overview, the first thing I did was to speak to the sergeant. I think you've told us that was Dalgleish.
Yep.
To ask what was happening and get a briefing on the incident in terms of everything known at that time. I was made aware of a number of 999 calls that had come in from members of the public regarding a male armed with a knife in a street in Kirkcaldy. One of the first things I did was to speak to the overview sergeant to confirm that the divisional inspector, PIO, that's K,
Yep.
and the local sergeant, that's Maxwell,
Yep.
were fully aware of the incident and that local officers had been dispatched and were attending. And the sergeant told me, yes, the PIO's aware, they've got command of it, and the divisional sergeant is attending along with numerous sets.
Yeah.
After that, I said, is there a dog being sent? Because these are a good tactical option suitable for a situation like this. So there was a dog dispatched at about 7:18. I can't remember the exact time, but we've actually looked at that on the storm log, and we noted that there was, the first dog unit was dispatched at 7:18. So had that happened just prior to you entering the overview, or at that point?
I honestly can't remember. I just remember that was the first thing I asked, one of the first things I asked. Is there a dog going? There needs to be a dog going to this.
And it was confirmed that by that stage a dog was attending.
Yeah.
So if we've seen on the storm log that SD10 was attending, and that was entered into the storm log at 7:18 and 18 seconds, would it just be shortly after that you entered the overview?
Yes, I think so anyway.
It says there in your statement, you were told by the Sergeant Dalgleish that yes, the PIO's aware, they've got command of it, and the Divisional Sergeant is attending along with numerous sets.
Yes.
Now, if we look for a moment at the spreadsheet, please. We heard evidence that the first call from PIO K, the Inspector K, was at 7:20:56. So if you look at page 4 of the spreadsheet, towards the top of that page, you should see the second entry effectively. There's Police Sergeant Stephen K. He was the acting inspector at that time, the PIO 7:20:56 from India 4, control keep off. That's somebody activated the emergency button. And that was his first airways transmission. Can you tell us, did you confirm in any way that the PIO was aware and had command of it?
No, I went on the word of my sergeant to say that the divisional inspector's fully aware of it. They've got command of it. Divisional sergeant's attending along with most of the shift. I think he said numerous sets, most of the shift. So I at that time I didn't speak to Stephen Kay about that.
You assumed that what Dalgleish was telling you was correct?
Yes, yeah.
And tell us, how would Sergeant Dalgleish have known that the PIO was aware at that time when you got into the control room, if you take it from me that Kay didn't actually come onto the airwaves transmission until shortly after your stay safe message?
Yeah. I don't know, unless he... I really don't know the answer to that, unless he's...
Is there a way he can find that out from the storm log?
I don't know. I don't know if he can. No, I don't know from the storm log.
Not from the storm log. And there's been no airwaves transmission by Kay prior to that.
Yeah.
So perhaps some other method. Can you think of what other method might be available?
I suppose what I think is maybe he has the information's gone out. It's gone out to the Scott Masterton's put that information out to the local sergeant and inspector. I don't know. That's maybe why he knows that they've got it and they're aware of it in the full set of circumstances in terms of all the information that's going out.
We've heard from Mr. Masterton that his first involvement was to deploy a unit, which turned out to be PC Tomlinson and PC Short. And then there was a request for further assistance, and Maxwell requested all units within a minute of that. We didn't hear anything from Mr. Masterton to suggest that he'd been in touch with the PIO or Sergeant Maxwell, other than what we see on the airwaves. Well, I won't ask you to speculate further. When it says they've got command of it, can I ask you what you took that to mean?
just that they were responding to it and dealing with it. It's a divisional incident. The sergeant was en route and sort of going with his officers to the incident. I did speak to Stephen Kay afterwards on a phone call, and I do remember him saying that he had given them the stay safe. So that was after I'd spoken.
That was after your message.
Yeah.
That was at a later period of time.
Yeah.
Would it surprise you to know that, as I understand Inspector Kay's evidence, that he did not have command of the situation? He was waiting for feedback from officers on the ground at that time.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a divisional inspector and there's a call that comes into your area, you have that command of that incident.
Is that
it's
automatically
it's the way that
that
Police
power?
Scotland. It's the way that Police Scotland works. You're in charge, in command of sort of any incident that comes into your area initially, and it could range from domestic incidents to missing persons to pub fights to road traffic accidents to incidents like this.
So at that moment of time, was it fair to say, as far as Sergeant Dalglish was concerned, as far as you're concerned, responsibility for this incident lies with the PIO?
Yeah, and that the incident would have been sort of risk assessed by the control room sergeant on the ground. The call would have been passed out. I imagine Stephen Kay would have been listening on his radio, or if he was at a computer, he would have seen the call as well. I mean, I can just speak from recent experience. When I was a divisional inspector, after I left the control room, I would be listening on the radio on my talk group, on my channel, so I would know what would be coming through to me, to my area. Or I'd see it on the computer.
Thank you. And just to tie in with one other comment that you've made at paragraph 54 of your inquiry statement, it's just beyond halfway down that paragraph. So that's 54, and it's just beyond halfway down. Keep going, that's it coming up. And you say, almost in the middle of the screen now, it is the divisional inspector, PIO, who has responsibility for an incident in their division area until it becomes too dangerous or a firearms deployment is required to deal with the level of threat. So that seems to tie in with what you've just said. Yeah. It's the PIO's responsibility for that incident in their area, unless or it becomes too dangerous or a firearms deployment is required.
Yeah.
And at that point, I think you've said a number of times now, if there was a firearms incident declared, responsibility and control and command would move to you.
Yes, because I'm trained to deploy firearms officers and have an understanding of the sort of tactics that they use.
And
so,
it's you that has the authority to deal with that then?
So the divisional inspector and sergeant sit on one side together. I sit sort of separately from them in terms of command structure, but if it was a declared firearms incident, then I would take charge of that.
Thank you. Can I ask you about paragraphs 19 and 20 of your inquiry statement? Now, let's start with 19 first of all. That's fine. So you're talking about calls coming in from members of the public. Divisional officers were dispatched. It was a knife call. And I determined the first thing for me was to make an operational risk assessment, which I did. And I think at your previous evidence, you talked about the national decision-making model. and the process of carrying out a risk assessment. So was that really, after you've been briefed by Dalgleish, is that the first thing you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing on that morning, I suppose I thought, so they're going to a knife call. What is the risk around that in terms of them continuing to go, because they're already going? What are they going with in terms of safety measures, control measures? Is it safe for them to continue to go, or do they not go? And the kind of thing that I was thinking about then was, it's a grade 1 call, it's a knife call. They know that all the information that we've got has been passed out to them. They've done officer safety training. You practice scenarios in relation to going to knife calls. They have their PPE, and they're going in vehicles. They're going with a supervisor as well. The information at that time was that there was a male with a knife, but nobody, there was no report of anybody being stabbed or harmed or injured by the male. So, and they were going in marked vehicles as well, which provided a protective element as well. So based on that information, that was me making that initial operational risk assessment. Yep, it's a knife call. I'm not going to say stop going, divisional inspector, sergeant, officer, stop going, because I considered that they had enough sort of built-in safety to go to that, which is sometimes different from a firearms incident where someone can shoot you from a distance away, as opposed to being able to keep that sort of safe gap from someone who is in possession of a knife.
So you were, in carrying out your risk assessment, you were taking into account all of those factors.
Yes.
And also what it wasn't. There wasn't a knife, there wasn't a gun,
Yeah.
a firearm said to be present. So different considerations may have applied at that time.
Yeah.
And then look at paragraph 20. You say at the beginning you're thinking to yourself, is it safe for them, unarmed divisional officers, to continue? And you talk there about what you've said. They had their PPE.
Yeah.
They've had officer safety training. As part of that training, they've practiced specific scenarios regarding knives. We've heard about the cut tactical option. And you talk about different approaches that they can take. You've talked about having police vehicles, giving them a protective cover, and the ability to get in and out quickly, the ability to stop or drive past the male if he's seen, the ability to contain an area as best they could, visually and physically, but from the safety of their vehicles, if the risk dictated this course of action was necessary. If I can pause there for a moment and ask what you mean by saying contain an area as best they could visually and physically, but from the safety of their vehicles.
Yeah, so if they attended and the feedback that they gave was such that males waving the knife about at them, behaving aggressively towards them, then they could stay in their vehicles and pull back and take up sort of positions to report back any sort of updates on what an individual was doing, what the level of threat was, where he was, yeah.
So you envisaged the vehicle itself as being part of the resources they had available to deal with the situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think you asked me the last time whether it was appropriate for someone to drive a vehicle at someone, and I'm not saying that at all, but it provides that element of protection, being able to drive up a street, drive past an individual, stop and then look back. If the individual was so violent that they couldn't approach them, then they could have their vehicles radio up from inside their vehicles as to what they were actually seeing. Mm-hmm. So it's another sort of almost like control measure, safety measure that they have in going to a call like that. That you're just thinking. So they're going in vehicles, they've got their training, they're going with their supervisor. yep, they can continue to go to an incident like that.
And then carry on in paragraph 20. You mentioned the divisional sergeant was attending. You can see that just slightly below
Yeah.
centre on the screen. I wanted to make sure that the sergeant was going, and I was aware he was issuing instructions to officers, reinforcing officer safety and requesting support from specialists such as a dog and ARV units, as well as coordinating that initial attendance. As I understand it, they'd been given that safety message by the sergeant who requested all officers to attend, so I'm thinking he's switched onto safety measures and control measures. I'm interested in how significant it was to you in your risk assessment that the Sergeant Maxwell, had requested all units an ARV and a dog unit.
Yeah, I mean, he's obviously gone to the incident thinking about safety, doesn't know what's on the ground ahead of him, so he's probably thinking, you know, what other specialists will I need? A dog unit and an ARV. So he's thinking along these lines, which is good. I don't know if that was the point, possibly, when they got in touch with me to tell me to come back up from the communications hall floor. If ARVs were getting asked for, you know, I'm not sure if that was, but
We can look at the spreadsheet again if that would help. So Sergeant Maxwell at 7:17 and 23 on page 2. So this is before you come into the overview room. So page 2 of the spreadsheet, 7:17:23. He makes a request for all units, an ARV and a dog.
yeah.
So he's made that specific request. He's the divisional sergeant on the ground, and he's made that request. And I'm interested in how significant you thought that was to your risk assessment.
Yeah, I never heard that. I mean, the risk assessment that I make is based on the national decision model and the firearms training that I undertook. So just because he's requesting an ARV doesn't necessarily mean that the threat is there. He's obviously thinking, male armed with a knife, I want everybody there, all the resources there, which is fine, but I have to go through a structured risk assessment, which I did, to determine whether or not I thought the level of threat and risk merited the deployment of an armed response vehicle at that time. And again, I work through my model, which is an assessment model. It also covers proportionality as well. So you're taking into consideration a lot of different things, including, you know, you need to know what's actually happening on the ground. We were doing as much as we possibly could in the control room to build up that intelligence, information picture, to understand the location, the subject, the risk to any persons in the area, what the threat was, and to who, and you're working through your threat and risk assessment, what an individual's identity is, its capability and intention. So you're going through all these things, and then you come up with your conclusion. There was not a lot of information that was known other than the stuff that was coming in through the treble 9 calls. So a lot of this was unknown. We knew nothing about who the individual was, why he was there, and what circumstances, whether it was a road rage incident, whether it was a neighbour's dispute, whether it was a fight, whether it was a feud, whether he was there to steal a carjack, whether or not he was having a mental health crisis, he was vulnerable, he was ill, under the influence of alcohol or drugs. You're thinking all these things, but you don't know because you just don't have that information available at the time. So the threat to the members of the public, you know, it's actually unknown what the threat is, but the concern that there's a high possibility that he might come into contact with members of the public, because people have already phoned in, and he's in that area. So
What we do know is that as acting police sergeant on the ground that day, Sergeant Maxwell was the sergeant to response team 4.
yeah.
And he was familiar with the members of that response team. So he had information from his own work about the individuals who were attending the scene that you wouldn't have had. But he would have known, for example, that PC Tomlinson, who was supposed to be responding, was a probationer. He would have known about Nicole Short, about her physical characteristics, that she was very new in the job as a response team member. I think there was a matter of weeks. And we've heard, for example, that, and there's evidence before the chair, that she was low in confidence at that time and quite fearful. So Sergeant Maxwell, being on the ground and being in charge of that response team 4, had a lot of additional information in his possession that you would not have had. And so I'm quite interested in what difference, if you had heard Sergeant Maxwell's transmission requesting an ARV, a dog unit in all units, if you had heard that and you had been in the room at that time, knowing that he was a sergeant on the ground and in charge of that team, what difference would that knowledge to you have made in regard to your risk assessment? Would you have given his views priority or some further consideration because he knew his team?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously didn't know his team at all. For me, I'm basing the deployment of, I understand what you're saying, but I'm basing my deployment on or my risk assessment on whether or not I think the threat is there that needs to be contained by armed officers, which is quite a significant sort of leap up in terms of response. And sometimes it's the appropriate response, absolutely. But I think attending the scene, understanding what is actually happening, being able to actually investigate the threat is important, because that is the latest up-to-date information that then feeds into my decision making as to whether to deploy an armed response vehicle to that. Officers attending the scene can often deal with a situation. It may not be as bad as initially reported, it may be worse, but you need to go to understand. I will not deploy an armed response vehicle on a knee-jerk reaction. It's got to be in line with my training, and considering all the risk factors. So I understand what you're saying about the shift maybe being young in service and things like that.
What information would you have needed to actually deploy an ARV that day?
I was looking for an up-to-date assessment as to what the male was actually doing, because it's a divisional incident. The officers attend knife and weapons calls throughout Police Scotland on a daily basis, and the majority of them do not have any kind of firearms response. What you're looking at is the threat and risk assessment. You're looking at understanding what's going on, and if the threat is to such a high level that unarmed officers can't deal with that individual, then that is when an armed response vehicle would be deployed. So attending at the scene and finding someone with their head in their hands or sitting down, you can resolve an incident quickly. My training was, they hammered it into me at training that, you make your decisions based on the most recent and up-to-date information that you have in front of you. So they were almost there as well, and I was going to get an update quite quickly as to just how significant and serious this situation was.
So not deploying an ARV until you have that feedback from the scene.
I felt that feedback from the scene was really important and essential to my decision making to deploy an armed response vehicle.
At any time did you consider deploying the ARV when the request was made, if you had heard Maxwell's request, but cancelling it, standing it down once you got that feedback from the scene?
Yeah, I mean, the time that I was in there, I was doing my assessment. So, you know, it took me the 2 minutes or however long I was in there to understand what was going on, try and ensure that the relevant checks were being done, work through my threat and risk assessment, and understand what was happening on the ground as best as possible. And we had limited information in relation to that. So for me to deploy armed officers, I'm really looking for the up-to-date information. I'm looking to have some kind of plan as well, some kind of tactical plan as to what's happening. And I felt I didn't have enough information. There was too many unknowns, and I wasn't sure of the risk as well, just in terms of how the risk the mail was posing, because you know, seen walking down the street in possession of a knife, you know, not acting angrily or aggressively, flailing his arms around, no person's injured as well or attacked by the male with the knife. So proportionality comes into it for me as well, in terms of, you know, what is this individual actually doing? You know, that's part of the consideration I have as well.
Well, there was some information in the storm log about him chasing a complainer's car with the knife, jumping in front of other cars and stopping them with the large knife. So there was some information about that activity, that behaviour, that interaction with people. Mm-hmm. But yes, no information that he'd attacked anyone.
No.
If you'd been in the overview room earlier at 7:14 when the storm log's created, or 7:15, would it have made a difference? Would it have given you more? It would have given you more time.
Yeah.
Would it have made a difference to your assessment that day?
I've thought about this, and I've thought about it quite a lot. So again, I would have asked officers to go, divisional officers, unarmed officers, to attend at the locus initially, to and provide feedback as to what was happening on the ground. And then I would have, whilst that was happening, dog handler would be away. The firearms vehicle was in Edinburgh. So, you know, you want to get your specialist resources as near as possible to the incident that's ongoing, if they're required. But again, if they're required is the key thing, because until you actually know what's facing you, you don't know the level of threat. So police officers going, investigating this call, these calls, actually seeing what's in front of them and providing that update is what you need. And again, if someone has a knife in a public place like this, you want police officers there as soon as you possibly can to keep people safe. So for me, it's what I've been trained to do, is to make sure that the public are kept safe.
Right, thank you. Can I ask you about, I think we touched on this at your previous evidence, about where you were when you weren't in the overview room.
Yeah.
And I think your Your perk statement from October 2015 said you were occupied elsewhere in the building, but I don't recall for what purpose. I may have been talking to one of the control room sergeants, but I can't be sure. And then I think in evidence you said that you couldn't remember exactly. And then I think if we turn to paragraph 30 of your second inquiry statement, you will see that you say you were an ACR inspector with responsibilities for wider control room functions, including staff. There's about 50 people on duty in the service area, and the area control that were on the shift that I have responsibility for. I can't recall specifically why I was down there. Likely I was down there to resolve an issue and check in with staff and supervisors in the service centre. So, looking back now, do you remember where you were?
Yeah, I was down in the big communications hall, and yeah, I was down there. I used to go down there. I would tell the staff in the overview I was going down there. I'd tell the staff in the overview if I was going to the toilet or I was going to make a cup of coffee normally. So I would have been down there, or I was down there, speaking to staff, trying to sort things out. It was a time in Police Scotland when we'd taken on sort of other divisions, legacy divisions, into the control room area. So often it required sort of duty officers like myself to be down there and walking the floor and linking in with staff if there were issues. So I did tend to go down and speak to my supervisors at the start of the shift if it allowed. So I do remember running up from the way I ran up the stairs. I must have been in the service centre area.
Right. And were you aware that at this time Sergeant Bissett, who was the sergeant in the Fife pod, the supervisor of Mr. Masterton, were you aware that he was absent from his station?
No.
No. Can I ask you about something? Sergeant Bissett's also given us a statement, you may be aware of it, paragraph 18, and that will be on the screen. And I asked Mr. Masterton about this earlier this morning. And you'll see it says on the 3rd of May, this is from Sergeant Bissett. He was a control room sergeant for about 12 weeks. I remember that my shift that morning started at 7. I was no sooner on duty when the duty officer, who was in the overview upstairs, phoned downstairs and said that the night shift had left a mess in the kitchen and he wanted one of the day shift officers to go up and clear it up. The duty officer that day was Inspector Steven Stewart. I couldn't recall that the inspector on duty was Steven Stewart. I know this having assisted Operation Turn in 2020. And Inspector Stewart was covering for our own inspector who was on leave. And then if we can move on to paragraph 19. And you'll see 4 lines down. I thought I received a phone call, or someone had a phone call from him about the mess in the kitchen, but that would mean he was in overview when the call was made. He was maybe phoned me and then came down to the control room, or it's possible that he's been down and said to me face to face, or somebody else face to face, have you seen the mess that our kitchen has been left in? I thought it was a phone call from the inspector, but the message could have been delivered in person. Does that help you remember reasons why you were down the stairs?
No, I wasn't downstairs because there were dishes left. No, I was downstairs in the service centre area. I actually can't remember speaking to Stephen about that at all, and I wouldn't have imagined the control room sergeant going up to sort the dishes.
That you wouldn't have expected him to do that personally?
No.
How long were you out of the room, the overview room?
I don't know, actually. I mean, I don't know if I was away from, I don't know if it was from 7 o'clock or, I don't know exactly.
Right. can we move on to paragraphs 33 to 36? We'll start with 33 of your inquiry statement rather than Sergeant Bissett's. I want to ask you about your stay safe message, which you'll remember was at 7:20 in the morning. We've looked at that a number of times. If you want to have that in front of you, it's on page 3, I think. It's page 3 of the spreadsheet. And if we can look at the very end of paragraph 33, please. So that's on the next page of the statement. Thank you. You'll see that I wanted to make sure that the officers knew to make that dynamic risk assessment and to feedback straight away, that they need to stop, pause, see what was in front of them and provide that feedback in accordance with their training, because that's what they're trained to do. I expected this to happen. So was it your expectation at that time that the officers who were attending would carry out an assessment and give you feedback?
Yes, I thought the officers that were going to the scene would attend and then provide that feedback as to what they were seeing in front of them at the time. For other officers that were attending, for their supervisor officers, and for me in the control room as well, so I could understand what was going on just in relation to specialist resources that might need to be deployed.
And then paragraph 34, as much as possible you want to avoid situations where anybody rushes in to deal with an incident. And then further down you talk about the officers being well-trained, highly skilled professionals who also have the ability to use their discretion in situations when they consider it appropriate. And was that your expectation at the time?
Yeah, I mean, my expectation was that they would stop and feedback exactly what they were seeing. But you know, individual officers have discretion to deal with a situation as they see fit as well, as the other side of things. And I'm sure that the Stay Safe actually mentions that you know, you can sort of act. I can't remember the exact words. It's if you think it's realistic, achievable, and appropriate, or something like that. You know, but in a situation like this one, you know, I would hope they would have stopped and fed back and waited for other officers to attend.
And do we see just above the centre of that paragraph, but the Stay Safe is a lengthy message about keeping yourself and others safe, and it is about see, tell and act.
Yeah.
So the act is at the end of that.
Yeah.
See, use your eyes effectively. Tell, is the tell the feedback that you were looking for?
Yeah, update the control room and your colleagues, and update them with what you're actually seeing. Does the person have a knife? What is the level of threat? Yeah.
And then paragraph 35, again still on the Stay Safe message, do we see 3 lines down, the officers that attended that location should know about the Stay Safe. It's a reinforcement from the controller to give them that. Did you expect the controller to have given them a Stay Safe message by that time?
So everybody knows about Stay Safe. It's an integral part of your training when you're attending incidents. So it should be ingrained. And it's every individual officer's responsibility, I would say, including supervisors, including myself in the control room. We did have these cards, or Stay Safe cards with the wording on the control room pods in front of the controllers, and you know, I would have preferred the control room to be able to give that Stay Safe message for officers that were en route, just to remind them of what they needed to do. We shouldn't have to, but you know, it's best practice, and I would say that goes up the line as well. It should be sort of local supervisors, controller. The controller can't do it because he's too busy or she's too busy, then the control room sergeant or the overview sergeant, and even myself as well, if the message is not being given, I think it's something that officers need to be reminded of. It's a reinforcement that you need to make that risk assessment. And feedback.
Were you aware at 7:20 when you made your message that there had been no message, stay safe message from the controller?
No, I wasn't aware of that at the time. I'm sure I asked Scott Dalglish actually if the stay safe message had been given, and could he confirm that it had been given, and I think he said, I'm not sure. So it was important for me to get on the radio at that last bit just before they went off to say, you need to make a risk assessment, and you need feedback straight away. Just what's in front of you.
Right.
But I acknowledge it wasn't the full stay safe message. It was what I said at the time for them to make that risk assessment.
And then at the end of paragraph 35, which is just at the top of the next page, please, do we see, I'll read it just from the bottom of the previous page. My clear preference is that officers don't deploy unilaterally or on their own without support. And I just want to be clear about what you mean by that, because obviously Masterton had deployed 2 officers, Tomlinson and Short, on their own. Tomlinson had requested assistance, and then Maxwell had requested. But what is it you mean by my clear preference is that officers don't deploy unilaterally or on their own without support?
For a dynamic incident like that, even as well for a pub fight, I wouldn't want officers to unnecessarily put themselves at risk by rushing in. Go see what's in front of you, feedback, wait for the next set to arrive, or even the next set of your supervisor to arrive. So, yeah, that's what I mean by that. Don't deploy on your own. Wait till backup arrives.
Thank you. Can I look at paragraph 36, please? You say, I thought the response officers were near the locus, but not as near as they were. It was only when I saw the video evidence during my attendance at the inquiry hearing that I realised the first set was further on than I was aware. I was told they were getting near to the scene, and that's when I gave it. Can I just ask you about this? If we look at the spreadsheet, you'll see at 7:19:50, which is page 3, top of page 3, 7:19:54, PC Allen Payton's transmission is Roger, that's us approaching the locus. So you're in the ACR room at this time,
yeah.
The overview room. And Masterton is talking about another call. And then 7:20:06, Allen Payton, yes, that's us on Hayfield Road, heading in that direction. And then you come on at 7:20:13 with your message. So I just want to be clear about paragraph 36. Were you aware of these airwaves transmissions that were being made on the radio?
No.
Prior, when you were in the overview room, but prior to your stay safe message?
I had my headset on, but it was up, and Michelle, the comms officer, had said to her, can you tell me where they are, when they're getting near, and I was working through my sort of assessment, trying to understand where this might be going, and I had said to her, tell me when they're getting nearer the location, so she did, and that was when I went on, but I was unaware that they were further on.
And at the time, in the evidence previously, we explained that it was during the course of your stay safe message that the first officers arrived.
Yeah.
Well, that was the first time you realised that?
Yeah.
You hadn't been aware of that before?
No.
If you had been aware that the officers were approaching the locus, the scene, and had actually arrived on Hayfield Road, what difference would that have made to you? If you'd been aware that they were very quickly approaching that and actually on Hayfield Road, would that have made any difference to you and your stay safe message at 7:20?
Ideally, I would have wanted to give that stay safe message earlier, before they arrived at the locust or just before they arrived at the locust, because I would want them to have in their minds before they were entering that street that we need to take our time, we need to make a dynamic risk assessment, and we need to feed back. Yeah.
So if you'd been in the room before 7:18, you would have been in a better position to give that message
Yes.
before the men arrived.
Yeah, yeah.
At that time, did you consider, when you were giving the stay safe message, any instruction to stay back or wait or observe?
I didn't realise, and it was only when I've attended the inquiry that I didn't realise that they were on the mail so quickly. I did because their emergency button was pressed, but you know, my thoughts were that they would probably enter the road and do a search from their vehicle for the mail, and then when they saw the mail at the first opportunity, they would sort of shout back a feedback to their colleagues, to their sergeant, and to the control room as well. So,
can I ask you about the feedback?
yeah.
Before your stay safe message, we know that Tomlinson sought assistance, Maxwell requested all units, the dog and the ARV. After your stay safe message at 7:20:13, which we can see on page 3, we then know that PC Peyton's emergency button is turned on at 7:20:42. That at 7:21:02 on the next page of the spreadsheet, there's a transmission from Peyton, officer injured. And at 7:21:19, Tomlinson's emergency button is on. Status is on. Do you see those things?
Yes.
So, although in terms of feedback you've not had a conversation or you've not had a briefing from someone at the scene, you have received information in the ACR.
Yeah.
Would that constitute feedback, the fact that 2 emergency buttons have been pressed and someone's saying officer injured? Does that constitute feedback?
It's different from the feedback I was, yeah, it is feedback, but it's different from the feedback I was looking for. The feedback I was probably looking for to begin with was, you know, that's a centred, we can see the male, he's standing 20 metres away from us, it looks as if it's the same male, he's in possession of a knife, he's waving it about of us, or he's not. So that was the kind of feedback I was looking for. This obviously is feedback from the emergency button going on. It gives me an indication of what's happening at the locus. So from that, I assumed that they were had come across them quickly. They'd maybe got out their vehicles and dealt with them on their own. Yeah, so that was feedback from what was happening live time.
But your expectation in calling for feedback in your stay safe message was more about from observations of what was happening.
Yeah,
that's what you were looking for.
Before they engaged with them, or they thought it was safe to engage with them, and they would feed that back.
When you realised that there was emergency status had been turned on for 2 officers and an officer was injured, at that time, did you consider deploying an ARV? No.
There's no... at that time, additional sets were attending. I mean, the ARV was in Edinburgh, so the ARV is not going to get there quickly at all. No other resources are going to get there quickly other than additional members of that team that are attending to provide that support.
So at that time, by the time the buttons have been pressed and the officer's injured, is it too late then to even really realistically consider an ARV?
Yes.
And at that time, did you consider declaring a firearms incident, or is that the?
No, not at that time. They're already there. They're already dealing with the male. I mean, I've pressed the emergency button myself as well when I've arrested people before, and sometimes if you're rolling about the ground with someone or they're resisting or something happens, then you would maybe do that. So, you know, that was the kind of thing I thought was maybe happening.
Can I go back again to the suggestion we discussed earlier about a rendezvous point?
Yeah.
At that time, did you consider telling officers to withdraw?
No, I think what's happened has already happened. I think additional officers have to go. So a rendezvous point for me is a more of a slow time decision. After that would be like a pause point. Stop, pause, see what's happening in front of you, and then you've got to go to the scene. But I would not, if an emergency button was pressed, my expectation would be the officers would continue to the scene to try and provide support to their colleagues. So I wouldn't say to them, don't go because the emergency button's pressed, because they've obviously pressed it for a reason. Can
I ask you? I know you've made it clear you don't think the rendezvous point would have been an option in these circumstances. We heard evidence from one of the police officers who was first on the scene, Mr. Payton, and he indicated in evidence to the chair that on arrival, Mr. Bile was walking briskly. He considered every knife incident to be a potential terrorism incident. He'd formed the immediate opinion that Mr. Bile needed to be brought under control, as he did not know if he did have a knife on him. He said it was too big a risk to sit back and contain. His eyes were bulging out of his head, indicative of intoxication, medical illness or mental health crisis, and provided visual information to consider a medical response being required. If you'd been given that feedback at the time, would that have made a difference to you in your risk assessment?
Yes.
What difference would that have made?
I would have. Well, for me, it would be about, not necessarily approaching the male, but we've talked about contain and negotiate, and give that space and time, because if someone's emotionally or mentally distressed or under the influence of some kind of drugs or substance, they may act unpredictably, erratically, and it is about, if it's safe to do so, give that space and time and try speaking to people, that early negotiation, but also the description as well, just in terms of the way the male was presenting. I would be concerned about what he had taken or what was going on for him. So the medical help or medical assistance would be a consideration of mine at that time, getting an ambulance.
In terms of medical assistance or medical help being a consideration, what would you have done in the control room?
I would have phoned for an ambulance or got someone in the control room to phone for an ambulance.
And that you would have done that on the basis of that information that I've read out?
Yeah. If someone is, you were quite graphic in what you read out in terms of how someone presented. So we're arriving at that scene later on. We don't know what's actually happened to that male in terms of, is it a physical illness? Is it a mental illness? Is it has he taken something? Has he been injured himself as a consequence of what's gone on before?
And what instructions or commands, if any, would you have given to officers at the scene if that information had been relayed to you?
I think someone under someone as you've described there it may not be easy for them to necessarily comply with instruction, or you've got to recognise that they might not be compliant. They might not be. It might be difficult to actually get through to them or communicate with them. So for me, it is that sort of trying to de-escalate. Trying to understand what's going on and trying to say what's happened.
And as far as you were concerned in the control room, what information or advice could you share with officers, or would you have shared with officers if you had been given that information? What would you have done other than calling for an ambulance?
Just if it's safe to do so, give that space and time, back off, ease off, try and speak to him, understand what's going on for him, if confirm or confirm whether or not he's got a weapon or he's not got a weapon, but just try and you've got to recognise that someone might not engage with you if they have a positive mindset that's affected by something.
Would you have encouraged them to wait and give time and space, as you've said?
If it was safe to do so, yeah. There are circumstances when it's not safe to do so. If someone was still in possession of a weapon and threatening officers with it, that it might not be appropriate to do that. But if they weren't, that sort of backing off what would be my preference. And
Mr. Payton also made the suggestion that instructions could have been given to pull the van up at a distance away, see what the man was doing, see if there was a weapon, see if there was space. And he also talked about the possibility of officers gathering a distance away from the subject in the car park at Gallagher's pub. You may recall there was a pub nearby near the roundabout. Yeah. Have you any views on that suggestion?
I do think you've got to approach the male. I think you've got, in a circumstance like that, you've got to approach someone. It depends how you approach them, but you have to approach them. You have to try and engage with them. You have to try and understand what's going on for them. You have to try and build up that rapport if you can, because all these things are de-escalatory techniques that may get you somewhere. They may not, but you've got to try, because someone might give up. They might not give up. But I think for me, engaging with someone in an appropriate manner is the way to sort of progress a situation like that, if it's safe to do so.
And does this tie in with what you said earlier about excluding preclusion and the minimum force required? Can I ask you to look at paragraph 42, please, of your inquiry statement? The ARV didn't go because I had 2 minutes to go through everything that was happening, go through my threat and risk assessment to everyone, go through my policy, powers and policies, my options and contingencies, and understand what was going on. I just want to be clear. Are you saying there that it didn't go because you didn't have enough time to think about it?
No, it didn't go because I'd worked through my threat and risk assessment, and there were too many unknowns in there for me, and in terms of proportionality as well, nobody had been injured by the male. He was behaving erratically, but I wanted that additional information from the scene by the officers who were almost there, to update what was actually happening in front of them. What risk was the male posing to members of the public or them? Because an ARV would be authorised to attend if the risk was high and they couldn't contain the situation and deal with the male.
I'm going to read from part of this paragraph. It's around 10 lines down, and it begins with the words, "I did believe the potential risk to members of the public." Do you see that? And I'll read through this. "I did believe the potential risk to members of the public to be high should they come into contact with the male. And because of this, my position was that divisional officers had to continue to attend at the location. We were getting unarmed officers there to understand what was going on. That then informs the decision making because it provides us with that additional update. Unarmed officers going there would also provide me with various other options in terms of taking that disruptive action, mitigating action, keeping the male under observation if he was located, doing any kind of investigative assessment, building up an understanding of who the person was, containing the area visibly and physically, allowing for the opportunity to communicate with the male, which is key in rapport building, and trying to de-escalate a situation. I noticed in the expert report that the suggestion was that the divisional officers should not approach the male and make attempts to communicate with him, but I disagree with that view and consider any opportunity to engage and negotiate is very important in an incident like this. Sometimes it may not be possible, and I recognise that as well. So you seem to be setting out here your views on a sort of what your plan was going to be once you'd got the feedback. We can maybe go back up so we can go through each individual element there. So you're talking about officers on the ground taking disruptive action, mitigating action, keeping the male under observation. Can you explain what you mean, what you were thinking about disruptive action or mitigating action?
Yeah, I mean, disruptive action is, you know, attending with your blue lights on and your sirens on can often have that effect of someone throwing drugs away, stolen property away, throwing a knife away. Mitigating action, you know, you can go and keep members of the public away, keep members of the public out. You know, put yourself in between a person and a row of houses or a shop or something like that to prevent them from going in, keeping someone under observation. Just to obviously that's quite.
You've described
quite clear,
what that is. And then investigative assessment, is that something that the raid officer would be doing behind the scenes?
Yeah, I mean, for me, that investigative assessment is if we can't trace them, or, you know, it might be that you can stop members of the public, or you can ask who this person is. You could knock a door, or, you know, if there were local shops nearby, you could try and find out, do you know that, you know, we're looking for this male, fits this description, have you seen him? It's about building up that information as to who the individual is.
And then we've talked about containing the area and allowing an opportunity to communicate with the man, key in rapport building and trying to de-escalate. And I think you've explained your position on that. And then you say, you note in the report the suggestion that they should not approach the male and make attempts to communicate with him. Do you see a difference between someone observing and maybe speaking to the person, or just observing?
Yeah, so observing someone from a distance would be, when you showed me the first footage of the van going round the roundabout, or cutting through the roundabout, you know, for me, observing someone would be stopping round about that area and seeing someone in the distance to understand what was going on, what you were seeing, and feeding that information back. And communicating with them would maybe be getting nearer, but it would be getting nearer, as near as possible, whilst it would still be safe, and asking, just try to communicate with the individual, just ask him what was happening, who he was and where he was going, and did he have a weapon, and just try to open that line of engagement.
Thank you. Can we look at paragraph 43, please? Sort of line 13 on that page. It's quite a long paragraph, but it starts, any tactical plan. So it's 3 lines up from the bottom of the screen. Any tactical plan would have to be flexible, but it would be greatly dependent on the information that came back at the time and the level of threat being faced. So again, it comes back to the information you're provided with from the scene.
Yeah.
Was there any part of your role to communicate your plan or your thoughts about the tactical plan with the officers on the ground?
Just so, this was still a divisional incident, managed by divisional supervisors. Dependent on the feedback that came from the officers on the ground, would then get an update as to just what was actually going on in relation to the seriousness of any threats faced, and then it would be from then on. It might still be a divisional incident with officers on the ground, but I would link in with them and you know, suggest tactical options that were appropriate if they weren't coming up with these, or they weren't quite sure what to do, or if the officers arrived and the threat was deemed to be too significant, the male had a knife and had lunged at them, then you know, I would take over, declare a firearms incident, and for the next 20 minutes or so I would have to try and organise these unarmed officers in a way that would try and protect the public, protect them, protect the individual, until the arrival of specialist officers or a dog handler, if they couldn't deal with him at that time. But the situation could have changed again within that period of time as well. So it would have to be really, really flexible. But in the 2 minutes that I was thinking about what I was going to do, the various scenarios, if he was going to seen going towards the hospital, continue at the hospital, or if he was going to go into a house, or he was going to stop a car and get in a car, or they were going to find him in an open space. You know, I was thinking through all the different sort of scenarios that might come, and how I might try and coordinate something if I had to take over. Yeah.
Okay. Lots of possibilities.
Oh, and getting that information back, that's why getting the information back from the scene was really important, to understand just what was happening, what the male was doing. Because if he wasn't there, we would need to sort of plan for searches to try and track him down, maybe knock on doors to see if anybody had seen him. So the information, there was no CCTV, the information that was coming in from Storm was really limited. The officers were almost at the scene, and I felt that information back was critical to understanding just what was going on, and that would impact on how we dealt with the male there and then, if it was safe to do so, or how we dealt with the male going forward.
So the feedback would have been key for you to narrow down all of those options and determine your next step. Yeah, I mean, I had these plans in place, but you know, a key part of my training is that, you know, you need the most recent up-to-date information that's available to you to inform your decision making, to make the best possible plan and decision making going forward. Okay, so in light of the plan that you had in your head about what your expectations were of how the officers would approach it, you've given your stay safe message, initial assessment and feedback. You have various thoughts going around your head about things that can be done, expectations of what the officers will do. From the spreadsheet, we can see that there wasn't anyone giving instructions to the officers to wait, observe, form an impression of the man or any of that, to build rapport, de-escalate, negotiate. None of that was being shared over the airwaves with the officers on the ground. Whose responsibility was it to share that sort of information with the officers, or was it wholly a matter for their discretion?
No, I mean, the divisional supervisor attending should have been organising the officers in a way considering these things.
Was that Sergeant Maxwell?
Yes, it would have been, because he was on the ground. So, you know, police officers attend sort of dynamic incidents like these on a regular basis, and it is about coordinating your response when you're going there, whether it's a housebreaking in progress or a pub fight or something like that. Police officers are used to going to incidents like that and coordinating activity, first set off at the locus, gives it update, you know, pause, feedback. These kind of things happen all the time. These were my considerations should they not be able to deal with that male. And you know, I suppose I was waiting on the feedback coming back to understand what was going on.
We've heard some evidence about the approach that was being taught to officers, the sort of ethos in 2015. And I wonder if I can get your comment on this and whether you knew about this. We have heard and we will hear that at the time maybe some officers felt that they immediately had to gain control and compliance, that involved maybe what's called a hard stop, strong verbal commands. It was about seizing control, and then after they'd secured that compliance, they went for de-escalation, but they were not diffusing a situation at the outset. Was that something that ethos or that mindset, was that something you were aware of at the time in 2015?
No, I used to do my officer safety training on an annual basis, and it was very much the sort of de-escalation approach is what I've always been taught. You know, you have to raise the level of force. You're looking to use the minimum level of force possible to achieve your objective safely. And sometimes that level of force has to be higher depending on what's happening with the subject. But I think if you go in at a high level, you've got, it's difficult to de-escalate probably. I think you've got to go in at a level where if you need to escalate, you can escalate. But it is more so about that.
So in 2015, in May 2015, were you aware of that sort of mindset being taken by officers?
No, I mean, I imagine individual officers will have their own different view on it, but I wasn't aware of that.
Thank you. Could you give me one moment just to check something? Thank you very much, Inspector Stewart.
I'm going to adjourn to consider one or two matters. Ms. McCall.
It arises, sir, out of a passage of questions that begins on page 155 of the transcript at line 16. Where Senior Counsel to the Inquiry has asked, from the spreadsheet we can see there wasn't anyone giving instructions to the officers to wait, observe, form an impression of the man, or any of that, build rapport, de-escalate, negotiate. None of that was being shared over the airwaves with the officers on the ground. And then she asked whose responsibility that was, and the witness said it was the divisional supervisor attending who should have been organising the officers in a way considering these things, and that was Sergeant Maxwell. And what I wanted to ask the witness about was when Sergeant Maxwell issued the only message that mentions officer safety, should officers have understood what that shorthand meant? And then to ask him about the requirement for any supervisor to have feedback if they don't have eyes on, bearing in mind that Sergeant Maxwell was driving to the scene and was the last of the officers to arrive, by which time Mr. Byer was already restrained on the ground in leg restraints. And then ask whether there was any reason that another supervisor, this witness, Inspector K or Sergeant Maxwell, couldn't have given that message. In other words, if they're all on parity in that respect.
Yes, very well. I shall allow you to ask these questions. But before I do so, could I, Ms. McMenamin, I wonder if you could ask your solicitor to check whether Mr. Stewart is available to return tomorrow morning, because it's a matter I still want to canvass with him. Maybe check that now. Thank you very much. So we can have the witness back in now, please. Mr. Stewart, I'm going to ask some questions by Miss McCall, who's the senior counsel for Sergeant Maxwell.
Sorry.
It's all right. Mr. Stewart, I wonder if you could have a look at the spreadsheet that's the audio-video timeline, and at page 2 of that, please. And broadly what I want to ask you about is the stay safe messaging and also other instructions to attending officers. So if you'll see, and the inquiry's already heard evidence about this, but you'll see at 07:17:23, Acting Sergeant Maxwell makes a transmission that he wants all units to attend that, bearing in mind officer safety, and then he asks for an ARV and a dog. Do you see that?
Yes.
The inquiry's already heard all the transmissions on this spreadsheet, and Sergeant Maxwell is the only officer to use the phrase officer safety. You follow me?
Yes.
Would he expect, given their training, his officers on the team to understand what that meant, even if it was shorthand for stay safe?
Could you just repeat that? Yeah.
You said, we've just contextualised a bit, you said earlier on in your evidence that the stay safe message is
Yeah.
ingrained in officers'
Yes,
training.
yeah.
And they should all understand what that means, and they should all have it in their minds.
Yeah.
And you said that even though you didn't give the full stay safe message when you told officers to attend, make initial assessment and feedback, they should understand what that meant.
Yeah.
And what I'm asking is, when Scott Maxwell said, bearing in mind officer safety, albeit that's a shorthand, would you expect his team to understand that was bringing to their mind the stay safe requirements?
I don't know the answer to that one because I don't know his team. But if, yeah, I mean he's there is reminding officers to be safe. So from that, I would think that they would have to be switching on and thinking to what I need to do to be safe at attending a sort of dynamic incident like this.
All right. Can I move on then? You were asked by Senior Counsel of the Inquiry, and she referred you to the spreadsheet, and she said, from the spreadsheet, we can see that there wasn't anyone giving instructions to the officers to wait, observe, form an impression of the man or any of that, to build rapport, de-escalate, negotiate. None of that was being shared over the airways with the officers on the ground. Do you remember being asked about that? And you were asked whose responsibility was it to share that sort of information with the officers, or was it wholly a matter for their discretion? And your answer was, no, I mean the divisional supervisor attending should have been organising the officers in a way considering these things. And you confirmed that was Sergeant Maxwell because he was on the ground. Remember saying that?
Yes, yes.
You may not be aware, because I appreciate you weren't in the ACR and you weren't getting a lot of, you weren't in the ACR the whole time in the overview room, you weren't getting a lot of feedback. But you'll understand, I think, that Sergeant Maxwell himself drove from Kirkcaldy to the locus of the incident. You're aware of that?
Yes.
And were you aware that he was the last of the shift to arrive?
No.
So by the time he arrived, Mr. Bayo was already on the ground, being restrained, with leg restraints applied. Do you follow me?
Yes.
Can we take it that any supervisor, whether it's you, Inspector K, the PIO, or Sergeant Maxwell when he's en route in the car, would be looking for feedback from the first officers on the scene?
Yes.
And can we take it that that sort of feedback would inform the supervising sergeant's instructions just as it would inform yours?
Yes.
And would you accept from the sequence of events that I've given you that Sergeant Maxwell was in no better position than you were or Inspector K was to give specific instructions about how to tackle the situation until they got feedback?
No. I mean, I've done that role as a response sergeant and under response inspector. Part of the sort of stay safe, there's specific responsibilities for a supervisor sort of who's attending, and it is about that attending, staying safe, thinking about observations, thinking about cordons, thinking about containment, thinking about sterile areas, thinking about information and intelligence gathering, and I'm thinking about any kind of sort of arrest plan. So I've personally have done that as a supervisor attending a locus. So I was busy doing my assessment and the information that I was trying to gather in the control room, but that's never stopped me from when I was a response sergeant attending a call like this from trying to organise my resources. But I would agree that other officers could have said that as well. But for me, primarily it's the officer supervisor on the ground that's directing these officers who should be organising them when they go there.
Mm-hmm. And I think what we saw was that, and you were told this, I think, when you returned to your overview room, was that Sergeant Maxwell was the one who'd instructed all units to attend.
Yeah.
He was the one that had asked for an ARV, and he was the one that had asked for a dog and told everyone to bear in mind officer safety. Is that right?
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Stewart, there are matters which my assessors have raised that I require to look further into, which I may wish to explore with you. So I'd be grateful if you would come back tomorrow morning for 10 o'clock and we'll look at that then. Thank you. So 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.